You guys know that I am a big wild game hunter. But I married into a family of big wild game hunting. And Steve took me one time pheasant hunting up in some northern state there. South Dakota, there you go. We went up there pheasant hunting. And it was a great experience. And I killed a few pheasants, and I killed at least one hen, but we don't have to talk about that one. But brought back home pheasants. Now they cleaned them for us up there, and got them all put together, put them in the freezer. We came home with them, frozen. And I came home and I put it in my freezer. Now they clean the birds for you, but they don't dissect the birds. You come home with a whole bird, okay? Beak and body and feet, talons and everything. So I put it in the freezer. Well, I'd forgotten that the pheasant was there in the freezer. And one day I hear a scream from our garage. And Brenda, I run out there, and Brenda's with the freezer door open going, "What in the world is that?" There's these feet sticking out right there out of the freezer like it was growing there in our freezer. And I had to explain to her that, hey, when you marry a big game hunter like me, you're gonna have to fix wild game. Well, today's story, Renewal Story, has a bit of wild game in it. All right, and let's begin not where the story begins. Let's begin with Peter's story. All right, Peter has a vision. This is in Acts chapter 10. He has a vision, and it's got to be shocking to him to experience this vision. He's in the port city of Joppa on the Mediterranean. He goes up to the rooftop patio up there for a break while they're preparing lunch downstairs, and he's praying while he's up there. And all of a sudden, this text says he falls into a trance. I don't know what this looks like or what. I've never had a similar experience, but he falls into a trance, and he has this vision. And if you know the story from the book of Acts, then this is not new news to you. But there's some in here who may not know this story, that there's this sheet that comes down, like a bed sheet that comes down from heaven. And inside this sheet, because it's being held up on four corners, inside this sheet is all kind of animals. Farm animals, animals that they sacrificed before, but also wild game. And even reptiles are inside this sheet. And a voice from heaven speaks, and he says, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." Now, I don't know if that shocks you or not, but it shocked Peter, because Peter was well versed with the dietary restrictions that the law laid upon the Jewish people. It's spelled out in the book of Leviticus, and in great detail, God explains what foods they could eat and what foods they couldn't eat. For instance, land animals. They could eat animals that had a split hoof and choose its cud. And it had to do both of those things. If it did one and not the other, they couldn't eat it. So cows are in, sheep are in, rabbits, pigs, not in. All right? Fish. They could eat fish if they had scales and fins. So tilapia in, shrimp not allowed. They could eat certain birds. Certain ones were acceptable, others were not. So chickens were okay, owls were forbidden. And I think we're all thankful for that, right? Insects, generally forbidden. Except you could eat certain insects that had jointed legs for hopping. So you could eat locusts, crickets, or grasshopper. And, if you wanted to fix a meal like that, I'm sure you could find some recipes for them. But all crawling, slithering, scurrying, creeping, undulating animals, they're forbidden. And I think we're thankful for that, right? As integral as the sacrificial system was in Jewish life, and we do a lot of rehearsing of that in our understanding of Judaism and the transformation into Christianity. Jim alluded to that this morning. As central as it was to go and offer sacrifices, it was the dietary laws of Judaism that touched every single Jewish man, woman, and child 3 times a day. This was a constant reminder of who they were and whose they were. And so when God, in this vision, lowers down this sheet with acceptable animals mixed in with totally forbidden animals, and he says, go ahead, Peter, kill some of these animals and eat them, he was in shock. He says, surely not, I, Lord. No, he says, I have never eaten anything impure or unclean. But even more shocking than the request to kill them was God's answer after that. Here's what he says in verse 15. Do not call anything impure that God has made clean. Peter's mind was blown at hearing that. This doesn't register on us. His mind was blown hearing that. God himself had told Moses that they could eat these animals over here, but these animals were unclean. And now God himself is telling Peter, how dare you call anything that I make unclean? You might think that would have been a wake-up call for Peter. It was not. They had that same conversation 2 more times. God says, Peter, kill and eat. Peter says, no, Lord, I'm not going to kill and eat. I don't eat unclean things. God says, don't call anything that I made unclean. And then the sheep disappears. And Peter awakens from his trance, his vision. No one said Peter was a quick study, you understand. He takes him a while to grasp things. All right, meanwhile, a day earlier, 30 miles up the coast in Caesarea, a man named Cornelius was also praying. And he also had a surprising vision. An angel of God called out to him, called him by name and told him, Cornelius, your prayers and your gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. And that vision had to scare Cornelius to death. For one, an angel speaking to him. I mean, that's going to get your attention, right? But also, he's hearing the angel say, God has taken notice of you. And what was most shocking is this. Cornelius wasn't a Jew. The text says he was a devout man. The text says that he was a God-fearing man. But he wasn't a Jew. He was a Gentile. Gentile is a word that Jewish people used to speak about everybody else that wasn't a Jew. So you had us, and then you had the Gentiles. From whatever country they came from, whatever language they spoke, all of them were Gentiles. Cornelius was an officer in the Roman army. He wasn't from Israel. He was stationed there, serving in the Roman army. He came to love the God of the Jewish people. That love for him began to shape Cornelius' moral character. He probably went to the synagogue to meet with the Jewish people there, to understand the God better. He likely read parts of the Jewish scripture, but he wasn't Jewish. He wasn't circumcised like every Jewish male was. He couldn't offer sacrifices for God in the temple. In fact, he couldn't even go into the temple. In the Jewish temple of Jesus' day, it really wasn't just a building, it was a complex. And there were spaces on the fringe where Gentiles could gather and get within earshot of the temple. But there was a stone railing that existed that Gentiles knew they couldn't cross over. Josephus says that there were placards carved in stone in Greek and in Latin warning Gentiles, don't cross this line. Stay here. In fact, this is one of them. They discovered in the late 1800s. And this one is in Istanbul, Turkey. And here's what it says. No foreigner is to enter, I don't read Greek, but I'll translate for you. No foreigner is to enter within the balustrade and forecourt around the sacrifice precinct. Whoever is caught will himself be responsible for his own consequential death. Okay? Don't cross this line. You've been warned. So why is that important? Why no Gentile into the temple area? Now, why no non-Jew in the area where they're offering sacrifices? Because Jehovah was a God of the Jewish people. He chose their forefather Abraham. He said, I'm going to bless your family, all of your descendants. I'm going to make it to a great nation. They were the ones to whom God gave the law. They were the ones who built the temple that stands or stood in Jerusalem. They were the ones who were commanded to offer sacrifices. And now this angel in this vision is telling Cornelius that his prayers and his good deeds for poor people, just like a sacrifice, has risen up to God as an acceptable memorial offering to him. And that's when the angel told Cornelius, send some guys down to Joppa. There's a man named Peter that you need to talk to. And so he sent him away. So we have two men here. One Jew, one not. One circumcised, one not. And they both received a shocking vision. Cornelius was shocked that the God of the Jews would even take notice of him, that he knew his name. Peter was shocked that the God of his ancestors, who told him not to eat certain foods, now was unconcerned about him eating non-kosher meats. And their meeting was going to disrupt what everything that people knew about religious practices, about evangelism, about the kingdom of God. So Cornelius' men went down and invited Peter to come up and visit. And probably one of the most notable comments in this story is that when Peter arrived, and this is in verse 25, it doesn't ring our bells, but it made a big point. It says, and Peter entered the house. No good Jew would enter the house of a Gentile. You would do business with them in the streets, in the markets. You would engage them where you had to, but you would never befriend a Gentile. You would never have table fellowship with it. You would never go into the house of a Gentile. And in fact, Peter told that to Cornelius. In verse 28, here's what he says. You know that it's unlawful for a Jew to associate with or even visit a Gentile. I think he's kind of explaining why he's there. You know, this is not where I'm supposed to be, but I was kind of drawn here by your invitation, by the vision that God gave me. Because Peter then said after that, and he's recalling what God had told him earlier. He says, but God told me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean. That is huge for Peter. Before this moment, Peter thought that Jehovah belonged to the Jews, that Jesus came to rescue the Jews, that when Jesus told his disciples, go into all the world, what he really meant was go into all the Jewish world and tell people the good news. But now Peter is slowly waking up to the possibility that Jehovah didn't belong to the Jews, that he was the God of all nations, every tribe, every culture, every continent. You know, it's human nature for us to hang out with people that are like us. You realize that, right? We kind of are drawn to people who are like us. Remember when I was in school and I went to a new school or began a new grade or graduated to a new school, going to the cafeteria the first time, that's always a tough moment, isn't it? Trying to find your place in the cafeteria. Sometimes I sit down, I don't know anybody, I sit down by somebody. Later on I realize they're kind of nerdy. And then I realize, oh, I'm with my people, you know? I'm just drawn to people who are kind of like me. But Jesus spent time with people who were dramatically not like him. The Samaritan woman, the demon-possessed man, tax collectors, prostitutes, even on occasion, a Gentile or two. And when he was criticized by the Jewish leadership for hanging out with tax collectors and sinners, here's what Jesus said. It's from Matthew chapter 9, verse 13. He says this, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick." You know, one of the most vivid visual pictures I have of those COVID years, do you remember them? Was this picture of doctors and nurses going to work every day in hospitals filled with sick people, filled with people who have life-threatening cases of COVID. While I'm hunkered down in my house, my hand sanitizer, my mask on, every day they're going into a world that I seek my best to try to avoid in order to help other people. And I'm sure if you were to ask them why they're doing this, they would say, because I'm a doctor. I'm a nurse. This is what I do. These people are sick and dying. They need my help. Jesus says something very familiar. He says, "I've not come to call the righteous. I've come for the sinners." And he calls us to the same mission. So Philip went to Samaria. We talked about that one. Peter went to Cornelius' home. Paul went to pagan cities. He spoke in marketplaces, public spaces. He had conversations with atheists and those who worship hundreds of gods. He ate with morally upright people, and he sat in prison with the most reprobate of sinners. He spoke to faithful Christians who hung on every word he had to say, and he spoke also to angry mobs who were ready to kill him for what he was saying. And he did so because God made it clear that no one out there should be considered unclean, beyond the reach of God's mercy, beyond God's attention. That was a hard lesson for Peter to learn. He was constantly surprised, even within this story, constantly surprised at what God was revealing to him. I mean, time and again throughout this whole story, you get Peter going, "Oh, now I get it." And then you realize, no, he's not getting it. Okay? But ultimately, Peter is there talking with Cornelius about the God of the country of the Jews. You see, he's not there yet. He talks about how Jesus came to rescue his people, about how the Romans had killed Jesus on the cross, about God who raised him up on the third day. And then he raised him up, according to Peter, because of the people. I think he means his own people. And then this non-Jew, this Cornelius guy, he was suddenly overcome by God's Spirit. He begins praising God out loud, and he begins to speak in languages he had never learned. And Peter said, "Wait a minute, I've seen that before. We've had that experience before." This is the same thing that happened to us on Pentecost, when God's Spirit came on us. And we could make sense of that because we were good Jewish people and followers of Jesus. But this is a Gentile. And that's when Peter says, surely we can't keep these people from being baptized. I mean, they've received the Spirit just like we did. I kind of get from Peter's comments, he wasn't really saying, hey, we should baptize these people. I think he's kind of saying, I really can't find a reason not to baptize them. Maybe it's not what I'm comfortable with, but it's what God is calling me to do. So Cornelius, his friends, his family, all baptized into Christ that day. You've got to assume Cornelius and his family, they had a learning curve, right? I mean, it took a while to get up to speed about what it was to know God and the God of the Jews and the story of Jesus. It took a while to begin to shape himself into the nature and the character of Jesus. But guess what? It was also a learning curve for Peter too, wasn't it? He had begun to see the mission and the call of God in much broader terms than just the people of the Jews. He had to see it as a worldwide mission. And then all of a sudden, he began to look back probably, and we do too, at the prophecies from the Old Testament, and they began to take on a different feel to it. Solomon in Psalm 25 gives this prophetic message. Then all nations will be blessed through him, and they will call him blessed. And Daniel's prophecy began to really make sense. He says, he was given authority and glory and sovereign powers. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. And Isaiah's words all of a sudden made perfect sense. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light, and on those living in the land of deep darkness, a light had dawned. And even Jesus' own words, when he says, go into all the world. Much more expansive mission. So the question we need to ask ourselves is this. Are we a church just for saved people? Just for people like us? The kind of people who can name all 4 Gospels just like that. People whose language is clean. People who share our moral code. People who know the appropriate time to stand up and worship and the appropriate time to sit down and worship and what to do with those 2 little cups. Are we a church just for saved people? Or are we concerned about people who walk in a world without a knowledge of what God has done for them? A God who says to Peter and to us, don't call anyone impure that I have made. 2 things we need to understand here. We need to see the value of all people, even those whose lives are dramatically different from ours. Jesus says in the book of John, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. And I think when we think about that, we think the world in terms of people like us who respond to him and listen to him and obey him and follow him and wear his name. That's the world, but that's not the world according to John. For God so loved every person in the world that he sent his one and only Son to die for them. We need to see the value of all people around us. You know that person who has a cubicle down from you who is just the most irritating person on the face of the planet? That you're hoping they either get fired or promoted because you can't work another day with them just feet away from you. David, you have people like that? No. Do you see value in someone like that? Someone who lives a life much different than yours, by a different worldview, with a different moral code. Do you see value in them? The same value that God sees? We need to see their value. We also need to see their potential. We need to see not who they are, but who they can become in Jesus Christ. That's why he called a hothead like Peter. That's why Jesus invited a Roman collaborator like Matthew. Jesus came down in a bright light and spoke to a terrorist named Saul. Because God did not just see who they were, he saw who they could become. When we talk about, are we going to be a church just for the saved, or are we a church for the world? I'm not really talking about what happens at 10:30 on Sunday mornings. I mean, I think non-Christians can come, and please invite your friends who don't have faith to come and share this time with us. But at the bottom, at the core, at the foundation, this is for us. This gathering is for people who share our worldview and can make sense of all we have to say. And this is for us. What I'm talking about is when I say, are we a church for the saved or for the world? What I'm talking about is, what are we doing the other 6 days of the week? Do you hang out with non-Christian people? Do you pray for them? Do you love and care for them with compassion? Do you initiate spiritual conversations with them? Do you share your story of faith with them? Do you see them as unclean? Or are you hearing God speaking in your ear when he says, no, don't call anything unclean that I've made? Let me tell you, you are the primary lifeline of hope for somebody in your life who doesn't know Jesus yet. You are their point of connection, where they can come face to face with their Creator. Your words, your actions, the time you spend loving them, all of that is like a flicker of light in darkness for them. You are that light to the world. And even if you prefer to do things with people who share your worldview, even if entering their world makes you a bit uncomfortable, all of that pales in comparison to the discomfort that Jesus felt when he left the throne of God in heaven, a world that he was very comfortable in. And he began to experience the limitations of humanity. He took on flesh. He hung around people who did not walk with a knowledge and appreciation of God. But he did so because he had so much value in their heart. He had so much potential when he saw them. We're going to sing a song today. Let me share one phrase out of the song with you. Who could imagine so great a mercy? What heart could fathom such boundless grace? The God of heaven stepped down from glory to wear my sin and to bear my shame. That's not a song we sing on Sunday morning. It is